Let's get to the scriptures. I'm going to turn to Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. Now it happened that while the crowd was pressing around him and listening to the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. And he saw two boats lying at the edge of the lake, but the fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. And he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from the land. And he sat down and began teaching the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered and said, "Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing, but I will do as you say and let down the nets." When they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat for them to come and help them. And they came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw that, he fell down at Jesus' feet, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For amazement had seized him and all his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not fear, for from now on you will be catching men." When they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. You know, when I first met Joanne, my wife, and I was kind of surprised to see that I heard this discussion before, but there are many things that we don't like. Like the same thing. For example, Ruth's Jesus ate broccoli, and my Jesus ate okra, and her Jesus hated okra. And we didn't like the same food. We didn't like the same color. We didn't like the same people. We didn't like the same church. But we still got married. That's what we do, right? But there's one person we both liked. If you asked who is our favorite disciple, we both have the same answer, which is Peter. So I wanted to speak on Peter today. So I told Joanne that I'm going to preach on Peter. So she looked at me like this, and she said, "Don't mess it up. Okay, don't mess it up." So Peter is her guy. So I especially need your prayer because I don't want to mess this one up. So, okay, now that I got it out of my chest. Peter's calling. This is probably one of the most familiar verses, and we know what it means and where it comes from, the context, background, everything. Interesting, my Bible, when I read from the Bible, this particular passage has a headline which says the first disciples. Right? The first disciples. This is kind of according to synoptic gospels, which I think I've explained before, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. According to these three gospels, this is where we see the disciples for the first time. The first calling of the disciples. This is where it all starts. Interesting, as we started the passage, now it happened that while the crowd was pressing around him and listening to the word of God, there was this big crowd, which Jesus himself is finding it difficult to manage. He still didn't have any assistant. Can you imagine being a big preacher with nobody to volunteer? Because at that time, there are no disciples, right? There is nobody to assist him. But yet, he was managing this big crowd by all on his own, without a secretary, without a promotional assistant, what have you. And then he calls this disciple. It all starts from here, or so we think. So we know, right? Some of us, because we don't have just the three gospels. We know there is one more gospel. So one more gospel, and so we know there is a background to this story. There is a flashback per se, right? There is an episode that happened before this, which kind of adds meaning to this story, without which a lot of things doesn't make sense in this passage. Now we know Jesus met Peter before, right? Now let's read that too. John chapter 1. I think it is, John chapter 2 verses 42. I'll tell you in a minute. Oh, it's actually John chapter 1, obviously. 40 to 42. John chapter 1 verses 40 to 42. One of the two who heard John speak who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He found first his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which translated means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. So in this flashback, we know there is a secret past to Simon. Simon is not just who Luke's think he is at that point, or Matthew or Mark think at that point. There is something that happened prior to this flashback, right? We all have, in a way, there is a secret past in our own life which defines who we are and our background, where we are coming from, right? So here in this episode, we see, technically, the first disciple here is Andrew, the brother of Peter. So we know from this episode three things. One, Peter has already met Jesus. Peter and Jesus are not being introduced for the first time. They have already seen each other. And the second thing we can see is that he knew who Jesus was. Right? Many people had no clue who Jesus was. They were just walking around seeing this new preacher. It's not uncommon in the first century Palestine for this, rabbinic teachings, like, charismatic preachers to arise and they say this and that. So, but Peter knew who he truly was. Here, in John chapter 1, verses 42, there Andrew said, "This is the Messiah." Jesus was introduced as the Messiah, which is who Jesus was, which not so many people knew at that time. So Peter, not only that he met Jesus, he had the right theology, in the sense he had the right understanding of Jesus, right? Now, even better, in this passage, not only that he has met Jesus, not only that he knew who Jesus was, Jesus also foretold his destiny. Jesus looked at Simon. Everybody looks at Simon will see a very poor or very smelly, not so looking older than Jesus, like a not so attractive fisherman. That's all who he was. But Jesus looked at him and he said, "You are Simon. That's what you think you are. But you know what? I have created you to be Peter. You are not who you think you are. You are someone else. You are not who you think you are. You have to be what you are meant to be. This is your destiny. Simon is who you are, but Peter is your destiny. Peter is he who you are meant to be. You are meant to be Peter." And Jesus called him in a journey from Simon to Peter, from who we are to who we are meant to be, who we are created to be. That calling, that foretelling of destiny happened to Peter at that point. This is our story too, right? When we meet Jesus for the first time, we had this fairly good knowledge about Jesus. We are all privileged to know Jesus. We are all privileged to meet Jesus. We are privileged to understand who Jesus is. And we also received a revelation from him about who we are. But then what happens? Life happens, right? Life happened to Peter. See, Peter is a busy man. And as you know from him, as you know about him from the scripture, he is a very practical thinker. At that time, and he had a very good introduction to Jesus, but then he has a job, right? Somebody has to pay the bills. And his brother Andrew, it's interesting, because when Luke narrated this passage which we read, Andrew is not there. So if you read the same passage in Matthew and Mark, it's like Jesus going there. They both avoid the story. They both skip the story of this big miracle. But in Matthew and Mark, we see Jesus calling Peter and Andrew together. But in Luke's narrative, Andrew is not there. Now, there is no debate about which is the right, which is the wrong. The point here is, Andrew was a little more into the prophets. Andrew is so good, he can spot the right prophets. That's why he was with John the Baptist, right? We read about that, right? Andrew was looking for pastors. Andrew was looking for preachers. Andrew was looking for prophets. Andrew was looking for the Messiah. And he knows how to spot the right one. So he was with John the Baptist. Then he realized John the Baptist said, no, I'm not the one. There he goes. Then he went after him. So Andrew, and I think Luke, I have mentioned in another class, Luke is a research scholar. Luke meticulously researches before he start writing things. So I believe that Luke's narrative, Andrew was not really there because Andrew is still looking for a prophet or seeking after where exactly the truth is, or maybe still following Jesus. But Peter at that point, he is still working. He has to pay the bills and he has to face the reality. And that he was, right? He was always a practical man in the scripture. And that happens to us too. We come to Christ and we are confronted with our own life and our own past, and then we receive a revelation and we get that excitement, we get that passion. But then we climb down from the mountain or from our retreat, what have you, right? We go to retreat and we get pumped up and then we come back because life happens. Nobody's fault. Nobody's fault, right? So then we are not sure where we are and where we are going to be, and not anymore what we are destined to be, right? We kind of miss that mark a little bit. And then Jesus comes calling, and Jesus is pursuing Peter. So what we read here, even though the passage says the first disciples, it is the first disciples, yet it is not the first encounter. It is the second encounter. Or I will say, Jesus is giving Peter a second chance. How many of us get that? Eh? You just look at Jesus' passion for Peter's destiny. We all call God. We all pursue God. We all seek after God. But the Bible presents a God who is calling us, who is pursuing us, who is seeking after humanity. And that's a dramatically different God from any other religion you see. God is looking for man. God is pursuing his man. And Jesus is pursuing his disciple. Peter, I'm coming to you again. I want to talk to you. So that's the difference between calling God and being called by God. Now, Peter is the one who is called by God. And Jesus enters into his life one more time. Here you are, Peter. Here is the second chance to fulfill your destiny on your journey from Simon to Peter. And here I am to help you. Here I am to confront you. And what happens is very interesting. Second chances. I have received a lot of second chances in my life too. Third chances, fourth chances. Most of the time, each time the chances come to us, it almost always comes with a certain kind of brokenness. Because in the first chance, it was a very decent conversation. It's almost like church, Peter comes with Andrew and, this is the Messiah. Oh, hi, Messiah. Nice meeting you. Really like you. And I don't know what the conversation was. That was it. But in the second conversation, there was an element of brokenness. The whole narrative, the whole passage when we read, first of all, Jesus, puts him in a precarious situation. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, hey, Peter, why don't you cast the net deep into the water? So Peter says, Master, we've been working hard all night long, right? And we couldn't catch anything. That's where I am at right now. Now, you might be a good teacher. You might be a good prophet. But you are a carpenter. You can teach me anything, but don't try to teach me fishing. Because that's one thing I'm really good at. I know this ocean by heart. I know all the strategic techniques of fishing. And don't teach me my craft. You teach me anything else. I'm here sitting theology and everything you can teach me. You can tell me I'm wrong in so many aspects. But don't tell me I'm wrong in my fishing strategy. Because I know this better than anybody in town. Now, when God allows you to fail at the very thing you are good at, remember, that's almost always is a second chance. Have that happened to you? See, if Peter was confronted with this brokenness or the second chance by getting sick, say, Peter could have taken it. Or, he got into an accident or he got into some business trouble. He could have taken it. But fishing, that's something he's good at. He will never fail in that. But in that very thing, God let him fail. And that also, sometimes, I think it's our story. It's not about Peter. It's our story. I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, going back to my second chance. When, it's precisely the same story happened to me in my life. I was in Kuwait. So this is back in the days, 1998. I used to be an IT guy like normal Indian people, right? And San Jose was Mecca. That's my destiny, right? That's what everybody, back in engineering college, we are all taught to go to San Jose. That's where the Jerusalem for us. So, so and at that time, 1998, I was an engineer with 7 years experience. And I studied SAP, which just came out at that time, 1998 SAP. Now everybody knows SAP, but at that time, it was such a big thing. And there was only 1 or 2 places in India who could even teach them. But I went and took a course in SAP, and I was just ready to go to San Jose, wherever God was going to send me. And then, we got married, and we had this opportunity to go to Kuwait. And I go to Kuwait, and, I'm not even thinking twice because I'm very good at what I'm doing. I was a very successful engineer. So, and I go to Kuwait, I have this very nice looking resume with 7 years experience with SAP and all that kind of stuff. And I knew that I would just get job right when I land. And my father-in-law has been there for 36 years or so. He knows everybody. So, getting a job was I didn't even think about it. But I remember being jobless in Kuwait. I realized that when I landed, Kuwait was still operating on MS-DOS at that time. MS-DOS, you know what I mean? I think they're still operating on MS-DOS, I don't know. But the point is, all what I had meant nothing in that particular climate. And I was overqualified for most of the job. And I remember God breaking me down. So we just got married at that time, as I said. And Joanne just finished her Bachelor's of Commerce. And she didn't even have 1 day of work experience. But she got a job in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks. She lands in Kuwait. In 2 weeks, she gets a very nice job. And I'm an engineer with 7 years experience with this incredible resume, but I'm not getting a job. I don't know why. And I remember, I don't know if I shared this, there was this time when I had to go out and get a haircut. I had to ask my father-in-law for a dinar for getting my haircut because I didn't have money. I just came from India. So I remember God is crushing my ego down, breaking me down so that he can completely build me up. But at that time, I remember if, God forbid, if I had an accident, I was going through that, I would have taken it. If I had something else going, I would have taken it. But engineering, me, with my resume, with my knowledge, and that I remember, that's when God is touching your ego. Ego is your very self we are created around us. God has to break our ego when he comes with a second chance. Does that make sense to you? And that's why God breaks Peter's ego by allowing him to fail at the very thing he was good at. Now, Peter is completely broken. 2 things happen because of that. First thing he yells, Lord, I am a sinful man. Go away from me. Go away from me. That is such a powerful, powerful thing for him to say that. What is sin? This creates another big question. What exactly is sin? Very often we have this different ideas about sin. When I was a kid growing up, and I had a very religious background, Orthodox church, and I never drank, I never smoked, and I don't even remember going to the movies with my family because we were very religious. So I thought I was a nice guy. But then this confrontation happens, and we realize that sin is not so much about what we are doing. It's about who we are. It's all about our being. When the sin is not becoming Peter. When God calls Simon, ask him to become Peter, that's what sin is. Does that make sense? Simon is saying that, I'm Simon, I'm a good boy, I'm with you, I'm very content in that. See, I am in your boat, right? Didn't I give you my boat? I'm willing to give my boat, I'm willing to give my fish, I'm willing to give you whatever I want, you want from me, not myself. I'll give you my boat. I can lease it to you. I won't even charge you. You can do your preaching or whatever. When you preach, I'll be by your side. I will listen to that. I will assist you with all the microphone and everything. But I'm not willing to give myself to you. I'm not willing to become Peter. I just want to be Simon. It's so good to be a Simon and sit in the boat. But God wants you to be a Peter and jump out of the water. Jump out of the boat and walk in that water. See, when God is calling us to be something, and when we are not becoming that, that is what the real sin is. Sin is not about drinking and smoking and all that kind of things, which are all sins. But the real sin is not fulfilling our destiny, fulfilling our calling, what God has called us to be. And last Sunday evening, we are having, as you know, we live in a senior citizen center, and they have a chapel. They invited me to speak at this chapel last Sunday afternoon. So I've never preached in that kind of a chapel before, because all those people in there are about 70 or 80, and it's very intimidating. They are very experienced in the knowledge. They might be preaching in pulpits or teaching Sunday school even before I was born, or even my father was born. That they are from that generation, that knowledgeable people. Anyway, so they were talking about, not my sermon per se, but they were talking about sins in life. And this lady, 93-year-old Julie, that's her name, 93 years old. And she is saying to us after, she's the one who invited me to preach. And then she was saying, oh, you know what? I'm still struggling with my sin. And I want to confess my sin to the Lord. And I'm looking at this woman and said, you are 93 years old. What kind of sins are you committing? And you live in a nursing home, for Pete's sake. I don't know what kind of sins that you can commit in a Christian Baptist nursing home. 93-year-old Julie is confessing her sin. You know what? Because Julie is always relating herself to Christ and her calling. And it's an ongoing basis. She is growing in that relationship. She is trying to see, am I fulfilling my destiny? Even though I'm only 93 years old, maybe I will live only for a couple of years longer, but God has a destiny for me till the very last breath I'm going to take. So am I fulfilling that destiny? If I am not, it doesn't matter if you're not going to watch movies or drinking or smoking. You are nothing less than a sinner. I'm talking about myself here too. So that's when I realized that, man, even though I think I'm this good guy doing everything right, and as long as I'm not fulfilling that destiny, and that moment, I remember God confronted me, just like this passage, a previous episode that happened in my life. Flashback years ago when I was in my engineering college again. I was so fortunate to have some friends like Joseph. And they invited me to a church group, and, I think I shared this story. And then I became a Christian, and I read the Bible, but then I had this transcendent experience. I dedicated myself to ministry at that point. But I kind of forgot that. Like Peter, life happened. Life happened. Got good job and, I was still a good guy. I was still going and preaching in churches. I was helping missions and missionaries, and I was a great Christian. So, like Peter, I will lease my boat to anybody, and, I will go with Jesus everywhere when he preached, and I'll be right by his side. But I was not fulfilling my calling, my destiny, who I am created to be. God took me for a second for that flashback. And then I said, Jesus, in Kuwait, this is what happened in Kuwait. Jesus, I am a sinful man. Forgive me from my pride. Thank you for breaking me down. And I want to live my destiny. I want to live my calling. So that's self-revelation. Who we are, that happened. And the next thing that happened is even more interesting. This Peter, who thought he knew everything about the ocean, this is what he says, right? He says, Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. But, okay, that all changed. So Peter is first giving his resume, right? Lord, I have enough work experience, right? I was working all night. It's his little resume. I know fishing. I was working all night. This is my resume, Lord. This is my logic. This is my experience. But I will do just as you say. Or in other words, Lord, I will take you at your words. I'm not going to think about this anymore. I am going to take Jesus at his words. It's very easy to say. It's very easy to sing. But taking Jesus at his words is probably one of the most difficult things I have done in my entire life. Because these two things, my logic and my experience, always comes in between. My little resume comes in between. It doesn't make sense. See, there are different steps. First, we start with, there are some words which kind of sounds the same but has different meaning. For example, belief, faith, trust. These kind of things kind of are in the same group, but they all have diametrically different meanings. For example, belief is belief in a system. Like Jesus is the Son of God is a belief, right? It's a belief system. Like that's what Peter had when he came to Jesus for the first time. You are the Messiah. Yeah. Right theology. Right belief system. But then he was willing to acknowledge that per se. I'm going to believe. So when we acknowledge that belief, it becomes faith. Yeah, I knew because I was born in a Christian family, I knew Jesus was the Son of God and all these kind of things. But in my engineering college, I accepted that. It became my faith. It became personal to me. So belief became faith. But it never became trust until I was in Kuwait. Because unless God breaks you down, that faith will always remain as faith. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's being Simon, the nice little Simon. But for us to be Peter, the faith has to become trust. And look at Jesus and say, Lord, I'm going to take you at your words. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to analyze this anymore. And that's why from that point onwards, if you see Peter, he has no logic or experience. That's why he was jumping out of the water, right? All the other people were thinking, what in the world that mean? How can we jump into the water? It's against the law of physics. The density of the water and the density of, these kind of things. I don't know if they were thinking that. But everybody knows that if I jump, it won't work. But Peter, at this moment, he took a decision. Lord, I am going to defy my logic. I am going to defy my experience. I am going to take you at your words. You ask me to jump, I'll jump. I might sink it. I don't care, but I know you are going to be there to lift me up. That's why many people think that Peter was this very, he was very temperamental. He was jumping ahead of. It's just because that's his experience. God broke him down and taught him to take Jesus at his words. So belief became faith, and faith became trust. And I'm going to end it with what happened next is even more interesting. So they have this big catch, right? And the miracle story. So they have this big catch and, 2 boats full, and 2 boats are going to sink, and they bring it back to the shore. And then Jesus says, Jesus didn't say it. This is what they do. This is what they do. When they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. What does that even mean? So they got this big catch. They just came to the land. The first thing I would do is to fry some of that fish and eat. I mean, like, I got this best catch I've never had, and also I didn't earn it. God gave it to me. God gave me this big blessing, but the moment they land, the next thing they have to do is leave everything, which include fish, include the net, include, of course, everything else they had, but including the very blessing they received from God. They had to leave everything, and the moment they landed, they had to leave. That, again, defies my logic. It is God who gave me a blessing, but you are now asking me to leave it? I didn't ask for it. I was not expecting a miracle. All I wanted was my usual quota of fish, but you gave me this big miracle, and now you are asking me to leave the very thing you gave me. Now that's the edge, the edge of faith, the boundaries of trust you can go, I guess. See, when we receive something from God, we tend to think that God just gave it to us. But realize it or not, when God gives you a blessing, He is not giving, you are not the owner of that blessing. You are a steward of the blessing. Do you remember that terminology? When God gives you a house, you don't own the house. You are a steward of the house. When God gives you a child, you don't own the child. You are a steward of the child. It belongs to Him. And that's why Abraham received a child from God and nobody else. And the next minute, God asked him, bring him back, sacrifice him. Abraham, like Peter, doesn't even think twice. Because these are the people who defied their logic and their experience. When God asked them to do something, God, it doesn't make any sense. I don't care about it because you asked me to do. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And that's what they did. That's what Hannah did, right? Hannah received Samuel from God after a long years of cry, and then God, and she just goes and give it back to God. So when we receive a blessing from God, and can we give it back to the Lord? And that's even another extended boundary of trust that we need to earn with God in so many ways, So that's why Jesus said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. I'm going to teach you how to fish men. Now, this is a big difference, between fishing, Jesus is basically telling Peter, you have a lot to unlearn when you come into ministry. See, that happens to me too personally. This is kind of my personal story in a way, because when I was an engineer, because I used to be strategic thing. I was in the managerial cadre for at least 4 or 5 years in my life. So when I came to ministry, I always used to think strategically. And how a corporate company will run, how a corporate organization will run. And that's the way I try to implement from my experience how that in ministry. But God had to teach me in a hard way. No, the fishing fish and fishing men are two different things. Because when you are in a corporate job, you own the job. You are the head. You are the profit center head. You are in charge. But when you are in my ministry, you own nothing. You just catch and then release. Have you heard that term? Yeah, in the fishing, if you want to Google it, and none of you are I have a fisher, I have a friend who used to do fishing. So I went with him. I don't normally like this fishing thing. It's a very quiet kind of thing. But this friend invited me to go for fishing. And we were sitting 2-3 hours in his boat. And we caught almost nothing like Peter. And was getting boring. But we were talking and we were, discussing scripture and all that kind of stuff. And finally, we got a fish. Good. So we got a fish. And we got this big one. I can't remember the name, and I'm not interested anyway. So he looked at it, and then immediately he took the hook off and released it back to the water. Then I'm like, what? What are you doing? Then he said, well, that's exactly what there's a type of fishing called catch and release. It's for conservation, preservation, whatever they have. So this is something, it didn't really make any sense to me at that time. But the point is, when God gives you something, we should be able to catch
and then release. That's what Peter did, right? And he had this amazing miracle, 2 boats full of fish. But the next moment, he releases it. He releases it because he has a bigger calling to fulfill. Even in ministry, as pastors, very difficult. When we get attached to people, right? I minister in churches. I still remember a church back in Toronto. I was the pastor for around 5 years, and then I had this calling to leave that ministry. And I knew it was, various circumstances happened. And then the people come to you, oh, pastor, don't leave. And we have to start another church. And we have to start a church next door here to preach. And we are all here because of you. All that kind of things. And people tend to get attached to it. I'm like that too. But then God, that's why many churches split. Because the pastors, sometimes they don't want to leave. Or when they leave, they want to take their fish with them, right? Whatever. So the point is, we don't own them. When God gives us a blessing, be ready to release that back into His hands.